All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Antonino. I think you've heard of me already enough, so let's go into our topic, space policy futures and lunar development. I'm lucky enough that I go after Chris. He gave you already a pretty good understanding of what the law conceptually is. In my talk, we're going to go a little bit more into a one-on-one of space law and policy, just to give you the fundamental basics of what these particular systems are. And then we're going to talk about the future of space policy and what does this mean for lunar development. And then, of course, we'll take questions. So the one thing that I want you to understand of space law, as Chris said, it's a little bit different than your ordinary legal system. Space law is a multi-level system. It's neither just international law or national law. It's both, right? It's two systems integrating with each other, and it's always going to be like that. You're never going to have purely international governance, but you're never going to go to space law only with national legislation. It will have to be both. And the distribution of, let's say, competences between these two levels is that international space law sets the foundational principles, the fundamental rules of the game, everything that shapes all the rest of the development, which are done at the national level. So national law does two things: interpretation and implementation, right? So states, through their national legislation or policies, interpret and shape the principles, the foundational rules that they have developed at the international level. And it's a cycle. They are not in isolation. The development of the national law will influence the future interpretation and evolution of international law, and vice versa. Here's a slide for you that I used to give to my students when I was lecturing in Luxembourg. These are the foundational principles of the Outer Space Treaty. This is just the very, very basic things that you will need to keep in mind when we think about space mining or lunar governance. Those are the fundamental rules, as Chris said, that we need to understand how they're going to apply to the moon, right? Space law, it's composed of 5 international treaties and a number of resolutions, plus implementing legislation. The most important of these treaties, the one that you need to remember today, it's the Outer Space Treaty, which is called the Magna Carta of Space. It provides the foundational rules, and those are the foundational rules. The question is, though, that these principles that you find in all the articles of the OST are general principles, and they are there for all space activities. So first of all, when people tell you the Outer Space Treaty is outdated, please don't believe that, because the Outer Space Treaty was never supposed to be a treaty on specific activities. It says even in the names, it's a treaty on principles. And these principles are relevant to telecommunication, to space mining, to space stations, to lunar governance, anything that you can do in space. All these principles apply. The question is, how are we going to apply them? And this is why we have policy. Space policy is the task of taking the general principles that we have at the international level in the Outer Space Treaty and implement them, make them specific, make them relevant for the moon. What does it mean, as Chris said before, that there shall be free access for all areas of celestial bodies? At the same time, there is also a freedom to establish a lunar station. How the two of them coexist? What does it mean? How much territory can you use on the moon before it becomes appropriation? This is what space policy needs to answer. And there are 3 ways to do that. There's multilateral development. Multilateral is the United Nations. All states come together in the room in the United Nations in Vienna and discuss until everybody is happy. Minilateral is some states come together, they want to do a project, and they decide these are the rules that will govern our project. I will not give you the Artemis Accords as an example. I'll give you the ISS as an example. The ISS is governed by intergovernmental agreement. The partners of the ISS come together and say, we want to have this station in space. This is how we're going to govern it. Someone does another space station, they will have different rules. The same is for Artemis. It's not there to govern the moon. It's there to govern the Artemis program. And in that sense, they have all the freedom they want, the countries of the Artemis program, to decide the principles that are going to apply to their activities, if and so long as they are compatible with international law. And then it's multi-stakeholder. It's everybody else. It's us in this room, not governments, people that have activities, that have expertise, that want to contribute to how governments will shape multilateral and minilateral policies. This is just to give you a few examples. In the last 5 years, when I started in this field 7 years ago, nobody cared for lunar governance. Nobody thought this was happening. Nobody thought this was relevant. And same for space mining. And now it's booming because we have activities planned, we have governments, and we have companies, and now it's addressed. And it's going to be more and more discussed until the point that we're going to come up with new rules. It's guaranteed. And these are some of the initiatives you need to keep your eyes on. There is the Working Group on Space Resources that was established already 3 years ago by the legal subcommittee in COPUOS. There is the ATLAC, Action Team on Lunar Activities Coordination, established just a few months ago by the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. And then there is UNUSA, who is getting more and more involved in these discussions and organized the first UN conference on sustainable lunar activities just a few months ago in Vienna. At the minilateral level, Chris mentioned it before, we have the Artemis Accords, but we also have ILRS. Not so many people talk about it, but the one difference that we have between Artemis and ILRS is that Artemis is a series of principles. They are voluntary, they're not binding. ILRS is governed by law. China concludes internationally legally binding agreement with the partners of the ILRS. And these agreements will govern the activities in a very specific way. They are not a policy document that you can distribute and have everybody sign on because they're specific to the activity you're doing together, much like the ISS agreement that I mentioned before. And then we have multi-stakeholder. Multi-stakeholder means all the entities that care for this topic, like Open Lunar, like my organization, Secure World Foundation, SGC, the Hague Working Group, all of us that think that we can contribute to this process, and Foresight Institute, of course. And then we move on, and we try to feed these processes. Now, the question that we need to keep in mind is that lunar development goes from one type mission, right? One scientific mission to large-scale and commercial operations. This is the question that we need to keep in mind when we think about how is the Outer Space Treaty applying to these activities. It's not what we used to do before, it's something new. And that's the future of space policy. We need a governance system. We need to go from a set of general principles to a system that allows us to develop these principles into concrete rules, licensing requirements, and that we can do that iteratively. This is not a one-time thing. We're not going to come up with the rules and they're going to stay like that forever. We will need to be able to change them, to adapt them. And again, we will need to be able to get multi-level governance, meaning that we get the national governments feeding an international process that influence further development at the national level. It's never going to be either or. And it has to be cohesive. It has to be comprehensive. We cannot just address lunar activities in isolation. We cannot just think about space mining as such. We need to think about lunar landing pads. We need to think about communication, how these things come together. The governance system should keep all of that in mind. And to address these questions, 2 years ago, together with the support of Open Lunar, I started the Lunar Policy Platform. And you're going to hear more about it today if you want to stay with us after 4 p.m., so I'm not going to go too much into details. But the question that we're trying to solve is, how do we develop these policies together in a way that it's attached to reality? We have some contributions that you can find online. We have a proposal for Lunar Policy Decalogue. We have done research on lunar policy priorities, and next we'll discuss this afternoon. I want to give you, as a final slide, just an overview of 10 priorities that will have to be addressed in order to ensure peaceful, safe, and sustainable lunar development. This is not my thinking. This is 40 different organizations that we interviewed last year and that came up with these suggestions, and this is what they have in common. This has never been done. And based on these priorities, we have a proposal for a policy decalogue. Those are the 10 things that we will need to develop in law and policy so that all of you that want to go to the moon can succeed. And we're going to do this, hopefully, together. So in conclusion, law will provide you the rules. Policy will build the governance. The future is to be written by all of us. Thank you very much.
I think we have time for just one.
From the things that are on Lunar Policy Platform now, are you seeing convergence or around actual policies?
Yes, I do. So this is one of the interesting things we discovered last year. We come from the assumption that because, for example, Artemis and ILRS are geopolitical rivalries, we think that they have nothing in common or that they're going to disagree. The reality is when you talk to these actors, they all have the same goals and they're all trying to achieve and build the same principles. So this June, as I mentioned before, the UN organized this conference on sustainable lunar activities. And there were panelists from Artemis and ILRS, from US and China, and they were asked, what are the top 5 priorities that you have? What are the top things that you want to ensure the moon? And they are the same, almost virtually the same. You can read the Copus report, I think it's paragraph 362, and there is a list that has been approved by the committee, and they will tell you those are the 5 things, and they are this 10 here. So we have convergence. The question is taking action, which sometimes it's difficult because it's a first mover disadvantage. Sometimes we think that being a first mover, it's great. This is scary. Nobody wants to get it wrong. You're going to be blamed forever. And so nobody wants to say, this is what we're going to do. Everybody's like, let's see, let's talk about it. And that's where we need to step up and go towards from priorities to actual tools. Okay. Talk to me later if you want. Thank you.